Hey friends, welcome to the Divorce Clarity Studio on WGSN-DB, Going Solo Network Radio, Podcasts, and TV. I'm your host, Lisa Lisser, CEO and founder of LZL Coaching, a boutique coaching firm focused on divorce, relationships, and life transitions. Like many of you, my life has been shaped by many chapters, from my early career as an attorney to a nonprofit leader and community builder, to a Jewish educator and spiritual counselor. And today, I'm a divorce coach. I can look back and see how each chapter quietly shaped how I accompany people through life's most profound transitions. I created the Divorce Clarity Studio because I believe divorce is about so much more than the legal process. It's about identity, relationships, parenting, finances, healing, and discovering who you really are. So whether you're considering divorce, in the middle of the process, learning to co-parent, or rebuilding your life afterward, my hope is simple, that you'll leave each conversation feeling a little less alone, a little more grounded, and a lot more confident in taking your next clarity-informed move. On today's show, we're going to talk about money and co-parenting. What are the financial flashpoints almost every co-parenting relationship hits? What do you do when you and your co-parent simply don't agree? What are the expenses that nobody remembers to put in the parenting plan? And for anyone already years into a plan that never addressed any of this, how do you fix it without reopening a war? In other words, we are going to future-proof your co-parenting finances before they blow up. My guest is Justin Milrad, a CDC certified divorce coach with an MBA, a financial planner, and the author of You 2.0, Divorce, A Better Way Forward, as well as the co-parenting playbook. He's the founder of Reclaim and Reboot Transformational Divorce Coaching and the host of The Conscious Divorce. Justin's background spans the apparel industry, strategy consulting, and serving as CEO of an outpatient mental health and addiction treatment center. He's also the co-founder of the Blue Dove Foundation, a nonprofit addressing mental health and addiction. After his own 15-year marriage ended in conflict, Justin rebuilt it into a fully functioning co-parenting relationship with his 3 kids at the center. His lived experience anchors the work he does every day. Justin, welcome to the Divorce Clarity Studio.
Hi, Lisa. It's so great to be here. And I absolutely loved your introduction. Everything you talked about the complexities and the different parts of divorce. When you really think about that in its entirety, there's a lot, but there's a lot of amazing coordination that can be done to do it well.
Yeah, absolutely. And your background in the mental health and addiction space may not necessarily seem like it segues right here, but I believe it actually does, because mental health and divorce are dysregulating moments, and how to walk through that in a strategic, step-by-step way is something that we do when we're helping recovering addicts walk through their recovery. So you have something to say?
Yeah, listen, you're right on about that. We grow up with life experiences. We have traumas when we're younger. We have traumas throughout life. And clearly, in a marriage that ended in divorce, there were traumas there as well. So I think understanding the interconnectivity of the mind, body, spirit, and soul is really, really important. And when we do that introspective work, we have a better understanding of why we act or react the way that we do. So you can't think about divorce without thinking about mental health and mental wellness, and really digging deep, not just in who you are, but who your former spouse was and what kind of made them a certain way. That way you truly understand how to navigate, and exist together.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I would like so much about that answer is that you're talking about the social, emotional, mental health, spiritual, soul space at the same time as we're going to be walking through financial strategies. So this is where the human intersects with the concrete practical. And that's really a lot of, sometimes these spaces crash into each other and don't connect, but we want to seamlessly blend them so that our audience can learn how to take strategy and let it impact their soul, and how they can take their soul and let it impact their strategy. So let's jump right in. Today's conversation will focus on how financial decisions that you didn't anticipate can derail an otherwise peaceful co-parenting scenario. So picture this. A parent is staring at a text message about a $4,000 orthodontia bill. 3 years after the divorce, no plan for who pays. She doesn't resolve it yet, but she names the theme. Money doesn't stop being a co-parenting issue when the ink dries. It just goes underground until it resurfaces in a conflict, usually at the worst possible moment. So, Justin, you work with co-parents every day. Why does money keep coming up as the thing that breaks an otherwise functional co-parenting relationship?
That's a great question. And I think when a couple is going through the divorce process, there's a lot of focus really on the division of assets. And that's, what are you going to get? What am I going to get? What's our life going to look like? And then when it comes to the kids, often, when it's decided in advance, we're going to do 50-50, and we talk about parenting schedules and stuff, the attorneys and the mediators don't really get into the deep work of money. And they, depending on how the agreements are crafted, they're very ambiguous. Like, we'll figure out, the cost of a wedding or the cost of university or a car at the time of, which really doesn't work. And the part that's really frustrating and difficult about the things that aren't decided, are the big expenses. So $4,000 is a big expense. And so is $250,000 per kid to go to a private university, or $35,000 for a car. And these are things that can be solved and resolved, or at least discussed about, and caps put in some sort of mechanism. But often they're not put into these agreements. And I have many clients come to me post-divorce where their co-parenting relationship is going bad and it's souring because of the discussion about money. And I just want to be clear, it's not just about the money, although the topic of money, you tense up over money in general, but often it's unresolved feelings from the marriage. If there was infidelity, or there was, verbal abuse, or some other type of abuse, or maybe, one partner never expected to be put in a certain situation, and there's bitterness and anger and all that. The who won and I want to keep winning, or they did this to me and therefore I'm going to do this back to them, happens. And it's really complicated. And I think the easiest way to resolve these things are, number one, make sure that you have a very thorough, well thought out parenting plan that discusses splits and also focuses on the ages and stages, as well as a way to resolve these issues if they come up. Because the reality is, your perception of buying your child a car and my perception of buying my child a car may be very different. You may be thinking, I'm going to buy them a new, Ford Bronco for $50,000. And my thought might be, I think a 6-year-old Honda Accord for $12,000 is the right move. And, neither of us are right or wrong, but we have to come up with some sort of compromise. So any sort of work you can do in advance will definitely make it easier and will reduce the chances of these things coming up.
Yeah, so I 100% agree. But what you also talked about there is the emotional baggage that we carry after divorce around money, because money might have been that one coercive control component of your relationship. And so post-divorce, if you feel like you are still being coercively controlled about the money, it's not going to go well. And it's going to, every time there's a money issue, that those emotions rise up, your soul is sort of broiling, your heart is racing. So if you can really articulate these big things, and it's not that hard to identify, to be really honest. We know that the kids are going to need orthodontia. And even if we don't know that when they're 3, we can anticipate they might need orthodontia. So that can go in the agreement. We hope that our kids will go to college. So we can have a plan for that and have maybe a percentage division, maybe have a cap based on the local state university, maybe anything that sort of aligns with your family circumstance. You can anticipate that if you want your children to have what they need in the future, look like what they've had in the past when you were married. So these are the kinds of decisions you can address. And even if all you put in is braces, college, car, and therapy, right? Like these are the things that we know you're going to have. Now you have addressed 4 big items that could be the biggest financial drains on your cash flow in the future. So tell us, how does this unresolved financial conflict actually reach the kids, even when the parents think that they're hiding it?
So first of all, I think we have to come to the radical acceptance that fairness and justice aren't necessarily going to happen. There could be some very big differences in circumstances. One parent may have a big inheritance, or they may have a trust fund, or they may have a job that pays significantly more. So I think that's really important to understand. And once you can accept that, there will be no fairness, there will be no justice, but we're going to do our best to do what's right by our kids, which to me is the most important filter, then I think, you can work together as co-parents. And listen, kids pick up on these things. They're very perceptive. So, parents, do not talk about finances in front of your kids. If you're having, a disagreement with your co-parent, take it offline privately. Do not put the other co-parent in a difficult situation. And this happens to me sometimes, and it drives me nuts. And I've had this discussion with my co-parent where it's, so-and-so kid needs, or wants to do this. Well, you're putting me in a really difficult position saying that in front of the kid, because even if I disagree, I'm the bad guy. And that's just not right. And just know that it's reciprocal. You shouldn't be doing that as well. So, anytime you discuss child support or financial frustration in front of the kids, you are putting your kids in a position of financial burden and in a fight and a difficult situation that they never agreed to join. So just be really careful and cautious about that.
So what would you say, like, that boundary actually is? Like, is it rigidity or is it just clarity?
Well, I think it's both, really, right? So, you clarify as many things as you possibly can, and then you come up with some ground rules. And these don't have to be in the parenting plan. It would be nice, but it doesn't have to be, where maybe you and the co-parent say, if there is an expense over $1,000, or there's a luxury of some sort, for the kid, then we have this conversation privately away from the kids. Maybe we don't do it in writing, but, and you hold that. And if you're put in a position in front of the kids, you can just remind the co-parent and say, we agreed that we're going to talk about this privately. So, I'm going to end the discussion on this topic right here and now, and you and I can talk about it privately.
Yeah.
And then, I think it's also good to say to your kids, I'm really sorry. I didn't mean for that to happen. Anything financial is really up, to me and your co-parent, or my co-parents, and we're going to resolve that. And I apologize. We will not put you in that situation again.
I think having accountability to the kids is really important. One thing that came up when you were talking about the big expenses, sometimes the little expenses can also feel like they're an imposition. Like if one parent gives the child a credit card, maybe the child in college, and then the child goes to CVS and buys toiletries. And then all of a sudden, the other parent months later gets a reconciliation and it has divide 575 from CVS because it's a joint expense. And, you know, how do we use language beforehand? Like if parent A gives children a credit card, is that parent A's responsibility, or how do we navigate that? You know, these are things we can actually discuss beforehand.
No doubt. So I think communication is really key. If there's something that needs to be purchased that kind of moves between houses, then out of courtesy, just tell the other parent, for example, shoes, right?
Yeah.
The shoes don't belong in a house. So say, hey, listen, I'm buying so-and-so, they need a new pair of running shoes. The ones we're looking at are $100. Are you okay with that? But if you also come up with budgets, or you have maxes, like you could say, okay, for each kid, you're permitted to spend $300 a year on new shoes. And if that gets exceeded, or there's a special event, then you have that conversation. You don't want to, get notified every time something gets picked up or purchased, because that's just a waste of everyone's time. But come up with some ground rules. And then, when it comes to things like, personal hygiene, cosmetics, all that stuff. Well, I will pay for what my child wants and needs at my house. And, the co-parent will pay for what the child needs and wants in their house. And things are going to go back and forth sometimes. And in some cases, you're going to pay too much. And in other cases, you're going to get the benefit. And I think you just have to trust that it's going to work itself out. But also ask yourself, the question of, if I raise this issue, how is it going to impact my child? Right. And then you have to make the decision: is the juice worth the squeeze?
Yeah, that's interesting. Is the juice worth the squeeze? That's a great metaphor that we're going to take a break on. So everyone ponder that. We're going to take 30 seconds for our sponsor, and then we'll be back with Justin Milrad and the money talk you've been avoiding. And we're back with CDC certified divorce coach, Justin Milrad. So, Justin, we're talking about money. And in your book, you talk about the financial clarity framework and naming categories before you fight over them. So what does that look like? What do you mean by naming categories?
So I think it's really important to identify all the things that you're going to end up purchasing for your kids, and some of the things and some of the things you don't know what the cost is going to be. So for example, a fixed expense, it's something that's predictable and recurring. So you could think, if your kid goes to private school, tuition, and every year expect a 3 or 4% increase. Insurance, agreed upon childcare. A variable expense is something that's necessary but fluctuating. So for example, clothing, school supplies, basic needs, the price of gasoline. And then you need to focus on things like the future, long-term costs. So your kids may be 3 and 4 years old. And if you aspire for them to go to college, you got to start thinking about that now. So things like college, any sort of major medical procedures, orthodontics, vehicles, milestone events like bar and bat mitzvahs, quinceañeras, sweet 16s. And, most financial conflict isn't really about the disagreement. It's about clarity and getting on the same page. If I know that every time my child goes to the doctor and the copay is $40 and they have to go to the doctor, I'm not going to fight over that. But, if my former spouse wants to throw a sweet 16, and we agreed to doing that, and she wants to spend $20,000, and I was thinking $800, then we have a real problem.
Yeah.
And in some cases, if our capabilities or the worth of certain things are different, we can agree to disagree. And I can say, well, I'm willing to pay a maximum of $2,000. And, if she really wants this $20,000 party, she's going to pay the difference. And that's her choice. But I think we need to be reasonable of what a prudent, I call it the prudent principle rule. What would a prudent person, be spending on such an event? And I think one other point that I want to bring up is, if you don't want to be surprised, do your research. Something that happened recently, my daughter turned 16. We agreed on a car. That wasn't a problem. But then when it came time to insure her, insurance for a 16-year-old girl is, we got quotes for $8,000 and $11,000. Well, that's a lot of money. And guess what? It's worse for a boy. So, what we could have and should have done is done the research before we bought the car, because that probably would have made a difference.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's, taking Justin's experience and leveraging it for your own divorce co-parenting agreement, right? Like you are learning from the potholes other people stepped in, not to put your foot in that hole. And so buying a car, yes, we can agree, but have you thought about the insurance? Let's put both of those things in the same bucket so it's not a blindside. And this is really where you have to think about what needs a joint decision and what one parent can handle. If one parent is insistent on that car and purchases a car, maybe that's the parent that's responsible for the insurance. So, there's a lot that goes into your pre-life experience planning, right?
And I want to reiterate that in many cases, these are expenses that you would have paid likely if you were still married. And in some cases, you get a raise. I have one client who, was paying for everything when they were married. And then now that they're divorced, they agreed 50-50, and he was complaining about school tuition. And I said, you got a 50% raise.
Yeah.
In the past, you would have paid all of this, and now you're paying half of it. And he's like, oh yeah, I never really thought about that. And he did the calculation in the way that they negotiated their agreement. He actually wasn't spending as much money. Now, of course, it could work in the opposite direction as well. But just remember, you shouldn't get mad at your spouse because your kid needs clothes. You
Right.
were going to buy those clothes anyways, but you can get mad if they're buying Aviator Nation, a $200 sweatshirt over, a $30 sweatshirt from the Gap. Those are areas that you can discuss.
Right. And if one parent wants their child to be wearing a certain kind of clothing that the other parent doesn't agree to, then that's okay. You can buy those clothes, but don't expect your co-parent to chip in 50%. That's not okay. So there's a lot that's part of the story. So how do you decide what needs a joint conversation? Just one where one parent can handle it on their own?
Well, first of all, I think for the big money items, you need to discuss that, and you need to discuss it quickly. We had the discussion on college, and when we were married, we had very different plans that had changed. So we had one kid who was 16, one who's 14, and one who's 10. So we had to make up a lot of ground, and then we both kind of stated our limitations. So by stating the limitations, we're like, this is what we can afford to do. And we're either going to have to apply for financial aid, or, we may have to make a different sort of decision as to maybe this school is no longer, a possibility. And we have to look at something that's more of a state school or something a little less expensive. So these are hard conversations, but they're also reality, because money doesn't just fall from a tree. Many of us, at least in the short term, we're at a fixed income level. And it's really hard to move from $120,000 to $500,000. Like it just doesn't happen, that easily. So these are conversations that you want to have now, and there's things that you can pre-plan. I bought a car last year. I needed a car, and my thought was in 3 or 4 years it would be a car that I would give for my son. So I would say I was kind of pre-planning that.
Right. So we know that these money conversations can like escalate into something really challenging that is weighted with all the emotions. So how can we de-escalate a money conversation? Like you mentioned something called BIF and the 48-hour rule.
Yeah. So I think many of us are familiar with BIF, with it, which is brief, informative, friendly, and firm. And I think you can state your position. The 48-hour rule is if you have a request and it's not urgent, take 48 hours before you respond, pause, really think about it, classify it. Does this expense fit a category that you've already agreed on? If it does, you may treat it a little differently. Sometimes you just need to find out some more information. If you still disagree, then it's a negotiation. And, if you can both calmly discuss it and make your points and share relevant information, hopefully you can come up with a resolution. But if you can't, you can escalate it. So in some cases, my clients escalate it to me, and I call in, both parents, and we make a case, and then we have a discussion. And, they can also include a parent coordinator or a mediator, or if it gets really complex, they can bring in a certified financial analyst. And if that still doesn't resolve it, it could be attorneys or it could be courts. Now, if you're getting to attorneys or court, that's a real problem.
Yeah.
Because it should never have to get to that point. And what a lot of people do is the first thing they do is they call their attorney. Well, you're dropping, or you're picking up, nickels, and for dollar bills, and it doesn't make sense.
Right.
So if you can resolve it on your own, then do it. ChatGPT, believe it or not, is a really good listener. So you can always, put in your predicament and see what it says. But, I'd say start with a divorce coach first.
Yeah, no, I obviously I agree with that, because part of what our training is alternate dispute resolution. Like coaching is about moving from positions to interests. Like what is the underlying interest here? What are we trying to accomplish? We want our kids to have continuing education. We want them to go to college. So what does that mean for us? And what do we think our children will gain from college? Have those value-based conversations, and then you can list the items that if we don't agree, then we go to a mediator. Or if we don't agree, first we go to our divorce coach and see if they can help us navigate. Then we go to a mediator. And only if we can't resolve it after mediation do we bring it to court. Or some people just say, stop, we have to mediate it. We don't have another juncture to go to because we're committed to not incurring the costs of litigation, because one motion can be $5,000 on each side. And so 10 grand to avoid a 40 grand expense, you're paying 20% of what the cost is, and you may not even win. So
Yep.
These are the cost benefit analyses that we want you to think about beforehand, because yeah, go on.
Yeah, sorry, I was going to say, and these are things that you can put in your parenting plan, or these are things you can agree and write down on paper and have discussions. And a lot of coaches recommend once a year you get together with your co-parent and you talk about how are things going. And, in addition to how are things going, well, in the next few years, let's plan 1 year, 3 year, 5 years out. Okay, we got to start talking about college. What does that look like? And at least if you have these conversations, there's a great framework there. The other thing is I've seen so many parenting plans without an escalation plan for disagreement. So make sure you have that in there, and make sure that it starts with someone like a divorce coach than a parent coordinator, because if it says automatically go to mediation or your attorney or court, you're going to be spending thousands, if not tens of thousands, possibly even hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Yeah. So I like that. We're putting in the layers before the money really starts draining. And these are financial conversations. So making this plan at the beginning, when you're drafting your agreements, is really the best way to resolve it when it occurs. And, we've mentioned a number of issues that become the big ticket items. So what you can also do is talk to people who have kids a little older than your kids and ask them, what are the expenses that came to bite you in the ass? What are those expenses that you didn't expect, but were part of your financial parenting experience? I think that that's a really valuable tool. And it doesn't have to be divorced parents. It could be anyone who has a kid who's 5 or 10 years older than yours, just so you get a sense of what's out there and you're not walking in blind. That's really important. So I'm going to go on.
Oh, I was going to say the number one reason why people get divorced is financial. So I love when you said, even if you're not divorced, have these conversations.
Yeah.
So, that if you have a child, at some point they're, going to go through these different ages and stages, and there's things that they're likely going to want, need, and do. So you got to plan for that, because you don't want to be caught with a 17-and-a-half-year-old and say, well, I don't have any plan for college. Yeah. Or you don't want to be caught with, a 15-year-old who really wants a car and you haven't thought about, insurance, whether it's on your car or their own car. Like these are not blind spots.
Yeah. They're not blind spots. They're part of your whole story, and they're part of many people's stories. So you're not the first person who needed to buy or who chose to buy their child a car. So let's look at the experience of those who went before you. So I want to go into a slightly different topic. We have about 7 minutes left, and talk about beyond the dollars. New partners, remarriage, and relocation. So you've said that this isn't really only about money in the literal sense, but time and relationships have financial weight too. So tell us, what about the new partners, and how does that fit into the financial stressors in a divorce?
That's a great one, and I can speak from my own personal experience. I'm about to get remarried. My fiance and I have been dating for 3 years, and she has a child. So I really need to think about the fact that I am now helping provide. We both contribute, but I am now helping to provide for another adult in my household and another child. So when things like that happen, still the money pool is finite. So when your, ex comes to you asking for money, even though the intention may be there, you also know that it may not be as readily available, and that's a hard conversation, and it's a hard place to be in. With that being said, if you're in a position like I am right now, you also got to think, well, I'm adding 2 more, mouths, to feed. So what are you going to do to compensate that? Another thing that people think is, immediately if you get remarried, that child support changes or gets cut off. It doesn't. It's still your duty to continue providing for your child. So a new spouse has no legal financial obligation for the children of the other marriage. Although they may choose to participate, they're not legally, they're not legally obligated to do that. And then, when a remarriage occurs, there's always a emotional and relational landscape. Income disparities between households, can happen. They become more visible, and the kids notice. So it does definitely influence the household. So I think that's really important. Also, you have to consider relocation becomes more of a possibility. and that is never an easy conversation. I'd say, anything that you can do to at least, stay in state or in city is really, really important, but you may change neighborhoods. You may impact the transportation. And, let's say you lived 7 miles apart and now you're going to live 40 miles apart. Well, that's time and money. It's more gas, it's less time working, it's more time traveling, it's more wear and tear on your car. So those are things that you really need to think about. And there's a ripple effect there.
Yeah.
So it really does, impact your overall expenses and your ability to contribute. But going back to what I call the North Star, do the right thing.
Okay. So all right, do the right thing. Tell us, what is the right thing?
Do what's right for your kids,
Yeah.
and also if you see that your former spouse is really struggling, let's say they lost a job or they had a sick parent or they had an accident, and they're on disability. If you have the means and you have the ability to fill a gap for a period of time, I always say, do the right thing. Do the right thing for your kids.
Yeah.
And those things hopefully are remembered, but at least you can feel like you're doing the right thing. There's no reason to kick someone when they're down.
Right. 100. And let's leave it at that because we're getting close to the end. Justin, tell my audience, what is your biggest takeaway that you want them to walk away with?
That's a good one. The biggest takeaway is that co-parenting doesn't have to be so hard. We overcomplicate it. Take your kids, make them the number one priority, and focus on the North Star, do the right thing, and then things, will look brighter. And then I'm going to add one more thing. Do as much pre-work as possible and as much forecasting as you possibly can, because it's the situations where things aren't discussed or defined and identified and quantified where the problems happen.
Yeah.
And
so I just want to say what that really means is when you are drafting your agreement or your memorandum of understanding, don't include a clause that says, we will decide on college questions when the time arises. Decide it now when you are making a lot of big decisions, but don't kick the can, because when you kick it down the road, when it finally hits, you're going to have another explosive moment in your life. And so don't put those big issues to be decided later. Decide as much as you can up front. And I think we're on the same page with this, Justin.
Yeah. And, check in every year. And sometimes things need to be modified. My attorney always said to me, in an ideal scenario, put your parenting plan in a drawer and just work with your co-parent and resolve things. You already know the percentages, but just work together and do the right thing. And I know that's not always possible. In a lot of cases, it's not at all possible, but try and create a situation where it becomes more likely.
Right. Great. So Justin, tell my audience how they can find you, how they can work with you, and what things you offer, like the co-parenting playbook.
Absolutely. So you can find me at www.reclaimandreboot.me. I offer a 30-minute, no pressure consultation to talk about whatever is on your mind related to divorce. I also wrote 3 books, U 2.0, Divorce a Better Way Forward, U 2.0, the workbook, which helps you with a lot of introspection, and then the co-parenting playbook with Jill Kaufman as well. My background, I work in mental health. I'm sorry?
So for my audience, the co-parenting playbook, the link for that on Amazon is right in the show notes, and it is at the bottom of our screen. So
thank you.
I'm always going to jump in because that's my backup plan. So to my audience, you can always find me at www.lzlcoaching.com. I offer a complimentary 30-minute consult, and I want to thank you for listening to the Divorce Clarity Studio. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe, like, and follow us. And if someone you know could benefit from this episode, please share. Remember, you're not alone, and you can walk with a guide on the side. And oh yeah, just one more reminder. Nothing in this program constitutes legal, therapeutic, or financial advice. We offer education and clarity. See you next time on the Divorce Clarity Studio.